Hello everybody, today I'm working on adding more defined details to this kitty painting. Not the final touches yet, but we're stepping beyond the base layers and into that middle ground where the painting starts to come alive. So, let's get started. For these details, I'm using a very small liner brush. Actually, it's sold as a nail brush, but I love it for painting fine lines and fur textures. It's very precise, it holds just the right amount of paint, and lets me get into those tiny areas without overworking them. Oh, and I love the sparkle design of them too. Yeah, this girl likes her sparklies. Now, if you're curious where to find this product, I've added a link in the description so you can check it out for yourself. The colors I'm using are phthalo blue, deep violet, aqua green, cerulean blue, and titanium white. Now, I use mostly Liquitex Basics acrylic paints, with the exception of the aqua green and the cerulean blue. Those are by the Artist Love brand from Michaels. Now, if this is the first video you're watching with this kitty subject, here's the reference photo that I'm working from, so that you know what I'm looking at as I'm refining those details. And if you want to see this painting from the very beginning, just go check out the videos that already covered this process up until this point. They are linked in the description. Now, at this stage, the painting is starting to take shape, but it still looks a little too soft and undefined. So this is where I start refining things. I'm going to add in those mid-level details that bring a bit more structure before the final touches. It's all about creating a balance between the loose, broad strokes from the base layers and the sharp precision that comes later. I focus on building depth, enhancing contrast, and defining key areas like the flow of the fur or subtle shifts in color. Now, these small changes might not seem dramatic on their own, but together, they really start to give the painting more life and dimension. I will be focusing on defining fur direction, deepening some shadows, and subtly adjusting colors, and you'll see me work on this a bit later in the video. It's not about adding every tiny hair just yet, but giving the illusion of detail. Well, let's talk about that. The illusion of detail. That's something I always have to remind myself of throughout my painting journey. Realism is not about copying every single strand of fur. It's also not capturing every microscopic detail. So if that is how you've approached your art, your paintings, this might just be your issue with your work not looking realistic. And I'm not saying this to make you feel bad, but I do want to burst your bubble here, okay? If your goal is to paint realistically, you're going to have to become a master of creating illusions. It's more about understanding how light, shadow, and texture work together to suggest those details to the viewer. Because you know what's so cool about our brain? Our eyes actually naturally fill in the gaps when our brain gets just enough information. So, for example, if you're standing a few feet away from a cat, you don't see every individual hair, right? You see clusters of fur, you see shifts in color, and the way light catches on certain areas. Now, that's what I've been trying to create here. Those soft transitions, adding just little variations, and using brushstrokes that mimic the flow of fur without obsessing over every line. Okay, so this approach not only makes the painting process less overwhelming, but it also keeps the artwork looking more natural. If you're going to add too many tiny details too soon, it can really flatten the image or make it feel overworked. Now, I have an example of that, my fox painting from 2022. I made this mistake there because I didn't know any better, and I was still learning and discovering how to do this fur business. So, when I look at that painting now, yeah, I see a fox. It's not a bad painting, but it sure isn't really realistic because I really added so many crazy little details. It feels a little overwhelming to look at. Now, by layering the illusion of detail first, you're going to leave room for the final highlights and the fine lines to just really stand out later, making them more impactful. So instead of thinking, I need to paint every single hair, I encourage you to shift your mindset to how can I make this area feel or look like fur? And that's often achieved with just thoughtful brushwork, some subtle color changes, and just the right balance between sharp and soft edges. Now, and even in this painting, I still fall into the trap at times of getting too detailed too soon. It's like my brain wants to skip ahead to that satisfying part where everything looks polished, but the painting isn't quite ready for that yet. So even after 2 years of working on enhancing my skills, I still have to catch myself, take a step back, and remind myself to just trust the process. It's not about perfection, it's about progress. Now, the good thing is that it can only get better from here, right? Each painting teaches me something new, even if it's just a small lesson. And those small lessons really add up over time. Now, here you see me putting down brushstrokes that go in different directions, as well as variations of length. I do this because the fur doesn't grow in perfectly straight, uniform lines. It flows, it shifts, it overlaps, depending on the contours of the body, the way that the light hits it, and even the animal's posture, as well as underlying bone and muscle structure. Adding these variations can really help to create a more natural, lifelike texture. If all the strokes were the same length and the same direction, the fur would end up looking flat and stiff, like almost like a solid block instead of something soft and dynamic. So by breaking up the pattern with shorter strokes here and longer ones there, and just even slightly curving and overlapping some of them, you can mimic that natural movement and the flow of the fur. It's also a great way to guide the viewer's eye gently across the painting. Our brains are wired to follow lines and patterns, so when the brushstrokes shift direction, it kind of adds interest and keeps the eye engaged, and it simultaneously will fill in the gaps and create its own natural image of fur. It's a relatively simple technique, but it really makes a difference in how the texture feels, even from a distance. Now, as I'm working on the soft tufts of the ear, I kind of realized that the bottom part of the stroke was too harsh, so I come in behind with my mop brush. I do this because the liner brush, while great for fine details, tends to leave a sharper starting point where that paint first hits the canvas. Now, that can be a bit too defined, especially when you're trying to create that soft, wispy look of fur around delicate areas like the ears. The mop brush is perfect for this because its soft, fluffy bristles just gently blend those edges without completely erasing the detail. It helps to smooth out the transition between the fur tufts and the underlying layers, and making everything feel more natural. I usually use a light touch, just barely grazing the surface so I can soften the harsh lines while keeping the texture intact. Speaking of grazing the surface, notice how I move my brush across the canvas here. I'm literally barely touching it to create those tiny little lines. Gentle strokes help prevent the paint from building up too thick, because that can make the texture look heavy or clumpy. Now instead, this technique will allow for fine wispy lines that mimic the natural softness of real fur. Now, how do you achieve this? Well, you can start by holding the brush a bit farther back on the handle, which helps to apply less pressure. Now imagine the brush just dancing lightly over the surface rather than pressing it down. The less pressure you use, the more natural the strokes will look. Now, I sometimes wave the brush just above the canvas and then move it a bit closer to the canvas with each wave until it just grazes the surface. It might take some practice, but no one ever said this was going to be easy, okay? And besides, I believe in you. You've seen me change up my brushstrokes here and there, and you've seen me moving around a bit as I work. Now, I'm constantly referring back to my reference photo to guide me, especially when it comes to placing the highlights. The reference is really crucial for helping me decide where the light is hitting the fur, so I can then translate that back to the canvas. However, it's not about copying that photo exactly. It's about interpreting those details and knowing how to apply that into your painting. in a way that just makes sense and adds dimension. And hey, it's totally fine if you want to follow the reference photo to the T. You'll still learn from the process no matter how you approach it. But for me, the reference is a tool. It's just there to guide me, not there to control me. Okay, so the real value is in learning from the process. Well, in the end, you'll learn and grow, whether you stick closely to your reference photo or just let your instincts take the lead. Now we're moving on to a technique I really enjoy using when working with short fur, and that is stippling. Now, if you're not familiar with stippling, it's essentially creating texture by lightly tapping the brush against the canvas, instead of using sweeping motions or long strokes. Now, it's a really great way to build up layers of fur without creating harsh lines. You'll notice me use this technique around the muzzle and the nose area where that fur is shorter and just a little bit finer. Why stippling? Well, short fur doesn't have the long flowing texture that we can work with in areas like, let's say, the ears, the neck, the top of the head. The fur is just more compact, so we need a technique that mimics that fine, dense texture. Stippling allows you to layer tiny dots of paint which kind of blend together to form the illusion of fur without over-defining each strand. And this is important when you want that soft, realistic feel, especially in areas where the fur doesn't stand out much. The slight variation in the stipple marks will add subtle depth, and the irregularity of the dots gives the fur that natural randomness we see in real life. So don't make identical dots in symmetric lines, okay? It won't add realism to your painting. Trust me. Also, don't overwork your strokes. Too much detail can make the fur look stiff or overly mechanical. We're trying to create the soft, natural look. Stippling gives you the ability to keep things light and airy and keeping the texture just light and not too heavy-handed. One thing I like to mention when using stippling is that it's all about control and patience. The technique may seem a little time-consuming at first, but it's incredibly rewarding because it creates such a beautiful, realistic finish. And you don't need to brush hard at all, just let the brush tap lightly against the canvas and build up those little dots slowly. What's nice about this is that it allows for a lot of room to play with highlights and shadows as you build up layers. It can even be used in combination with regular hair strokes to create smooth transitions between areas of different fur lengths. As I move into more fur and hair-like strokes now, I'm just completely in my element here, okay? There's something about the flow of it that makes everything feel so natural. I'm really enjoying the process at this stage. It's one of those moments where I'm fully immersed in the details and it feels almost meditative. This is where the painting really starts to come alive for me. It's not just about filling in spaces anymore. It's about capturing that texture, that feeling of life within the fur. I'm also so happy with this brush. It's the perfect size for making those super fine lines that make all the difference when painting detailed fur. The smaller tip gives me so much control, especially when I'm working in areas like the chin, where the fur just needs to be delicate and well defined. With a brush like this, it's almost like I'm painting each individual strand with precision, and the effect is exactly what I'm looking for. The small size of the brush really helps me get those fine details that larger brushes just can't manage. And as I'm working on this chin, I'm noticing that just placing a few of these highlights make this part of the painting come to life so quickly. It's amazing how something as simple as adding a little touch of light can transform the entire piece. Highlights are so crucial. They create depth, they show form, they really make the subject pop. Now, as soon as I lay down these lighter strokes, the chin starts to look more three-dimensional. It's one of those magical moments where you can see your vision just start to unfold right before your eyes. What I love about this stage is that each stroke helps bring the subject into focus. The more I layer in these smaller details, the clearer the structure becomes. It's not about making everything perfect yet, but refining the features so it starts to look more realistic. The fur texture is just beginning to show and the subject feels more defined. It's a gradual process. Just adding a few more strokes here and there, and little by little, it just starts to look more like what I had in mind. These smaller details help tie everything in and make the whole piece feel more solid. I'm painting these tiny hair-like strokes, and I'm still using the same color that I started with. It's a mixture of aqua green and white. I haven't changed it since I've started this painting session, and that's because sometimes less is more. It's not always about having a bunch of different shades. It's about how you apply the color that you already have. By varying the pressure of the brush and the direction of the strokes, you can just create a illusion of depth and texture without needing to constantly switch colors. This keeps things simple but effective, and it allows you to build layers gradually and keep the painting more cohesive. Plus, the painting does have a bunch of colors in it already, so adding too many shades will most likely make the piece a bit confusing to look at, and it can actually make things feel a bit chaotic. It's easy to lose the structure of the piece because your focus shifts from form and texture to, well, just managing all the different shades. It can also make the painting more muddy if the colors aren't blending well, especially with fur, where subtle transitions really do matter. Now, sticking to one color for longer helps me stay focused on the shapes and flow, making the final layers look more natural. But with that said, I've been thinking about this piece because honestly, there are quite a few colors in it, and I'm starting to wonder if I could have kept it even simpler. It's not that it's wrong to use more colors, but sometimes I catch myself questioning if it's adding to the piece or just making things more complicated than they need to be. So moving forward, I might experiment with limiting my palette even more to see how that affects the overall feel. It's always a bit of trial and error, but that's part of what makes the process interesting, right? I'm constantly learning what works best. I zoomed out a little as I'm moving onto the neck and the chest area, where the fur starts to just shift in texture and direction. Now, this section needs some highlights to break up the darker tones and add more depth. So I'm still using light controlled strokes, but I'm paying closer attention to how the fur naturally falls in this area. It's a bit softer and fluffier compared to the other parts of the face. Now I'm layering the highlights gradually, making sure not to overdo it because I still want to maintain that natural look. As I'm working, I also start adding those wispy single strands of fur that really stand out against the black background. These are some of my favorite details to add because they create that realistic, slightly messy look that real fur has. Now, to get that effect, I just lighten my touch even more, almost like I'm just grazing the surface with the tip of my brush. It's easy to press too hard and lose that delicate feel, so I constantly remind myself to stay relaxed with my hand and just let the brush do the work. What's interesting about these stray hairs is how they help break the outline of the subject, because without them, the edges can just look way too sharp or really clean. Doesn't feel natural when you're painting fur. Real animals always have these little flyaway strands, and adding them brings an extra layer of realism. It's not about adding a ton, just a few here and there to suggest that texture. Now, and also make sure to vary the length and the direction slightly so they don't look too uniform, which helps to keep the painting feeling more dynamic and alive. Now I'm shifting my technique a bit to create softer looking fur. Now, interestingly, even though I want the fur to appear softer, I'm actually applying a bit more pressure with my brush here. And this might seem counterintuitive because we often think that a lighter touch equals softer results, but in this case, the added pressure helps blend the paint more smoothly into the layers underneath. I'm not focusing on creating sharp, defined hair-like strokes. Instead, I'm just adding light to the area, almost like I'm brushing the light itself onto the canvas. It's more about creating a gentle transition between the highlights and the darker areas, giving the fur a subtle, diffused look without outlining every strand. And this technique helps to balance out the more detailed sections, adding variety to the texture and making the fur feel more natural overall. Now I'm switching to longer brush strokes compared to the shorter ones I used on the chin. This helps create a natural flow in the fur, reflecting how it grows differently in this area. The longer strokes just give a sense of movement and softness, which contrasts nicely with the tighter, more compact fur on the chin. I'm also overlapping some of these strokes into the shadow areas to make the highlights stand out a bit more, adding depth without making it look too sharp. After that, I move to the back part of the cat here where I add some wispy brush strokes. Now here I'm more reserved because I don't want the highlights to be too bright. I'm still using the same color, so I have to be super gentle with my touch. It's all about balance. I just want a hint of light to suggest the texture, but I'm careful not to overdo it. If the highlights get too strong, they'll compete with the focal point of the painting, and I really want this area to feel subtle, like it's just sitting there quietly in the background, while still adding to the overall depth. If you're still watching at this point, I just want to say how truly grateful I am that you're here, sticking with me through this process. It means a lot. Thank you. Now I'm shifting to a slightly darker color to add some shadows back into the highlights that I laid down earlier. And you'll notice that the techniques from this point forward will just kind of stay the same. It's really just a rinse and repeat process from here. So to keep things flowing, I'm going to fast forward through the next part since it's more of what you've already seen, right? But don't go anywhere. I'll slow things down whenever I switch colors and change brushes, or if there's something specific I think that will be useful for you to know. My goal is not just to show you what I'm doing, but to make sure that you're getting value out of it, that you're learning something that you can apply to your own work. And I really hope that you've picked up something helpful so far. Whether it's a new technique, a different way of looking at fur details, or just feeling more confident in your own painting journey. So don't go anywhere, okay? Enjoy a more time-lapse part of this painting session, and I'll check in here and there where needed. Now that we fast forwarded a bit, I'm adding in some phthalo blue, and I've got to say, I absolutely love this color. There's just something about it that instantly pleases me. It's not just acting as a shadow here, it's just adding this beautiful pop of color that just brings so much life and depth to this painting. It's rich, it's vibrant, and has this almost magical way of enhancing the contrast without feeling too overpowering. It adds a sense of richness and vibrancy, giving the fur just more dimension and making the whole piece just feel more engaging. It's moments like this that really make the process just so incredibly rewarding. Now I'm switching things up with a new color. I've mixed some deep violet with a bit of white to create this beautiful soft shade for the next round of highlights. It's got just the right balance of richness from the violet and the lightness from the white. It's going to really help add a fresh layer of depth without being too harsh. Now, as I apply it, you'll see it gently lifts certain areas, creating a really nice contrast against the darker shadows and just adding more dimension to the fur. It definitely takes some patience to build up these layers, okay? This process is not for the weak, y'all. I tell you that. But honestly, that's part of what I love about it. There's something really satisfying about watching the piece just slowly come together, just one careful stroke at a time. Now I'm switching to a round brush for some glazing. Glazing is all about applying a thin, transparent layer of color over the existing paint to adjust the tone, deepen shadows, or even correct areas where the highlights may have pushed the colors back a little bit too much. It's like adding a soft filter to the painting without covering up the details underneath. Now, in this case, it just helps me bring some of the shadows back to life, creating more depth and balance. It's a subtle process, but it really makes a difference in how the colors interact, giving that fur a more natural, cohesive look. Now I go in a bit bold here with the color, and I realized it was a bit too much. So I come in right after with my mop brush, and that mop brush is just perfect for this because it's soft and fluffy and it allows me to gently diffuse the glaze and soften the edges. It just helps blend it seamlessly into the surrounding areas without losing that depth that I just added. It's all about finding that balance, adding boldness where it's needed, but keeping the transition smooth and natural. Here's a look at the first photo I took after the initial color wash, the background, and that first layer of shadows. Now let's transition to the photo I took right after I finished this painting session. Well, in case you're curious, between these two pictures, there's about 3.5 hours of work. That's broken up into 3 different paint sessions on different days. Well, I have still to finish the eye, the final highlights, and the whiskers, so stay tuned for that, okay? And in the meantime, stay happy, keep your peace, and God bless you. Bye-bye!